Now, vaccination may have been opened up to 16-year-olds now, but the government is still facing a problem with lack of vaccine uptake in younger age groups. Now, in an attempt to woo 20-somethings after telling them they'll be banned from nightclubs and maybe their university lectures too, the government is promising discounts with Uber and Deliveroo as bribes. Will it work? I'm joined by Rory Sutherland, the Spectator's Wikiman columnist and vice chairman at the advertising agency Ogilvy. Rory, thanks for joining Spectator TV. What do you reckon? Do you think this is going to work?
They probably will work. I mean, I'm very sceptical generally about mainstream economics, but I wouldn't be so extreme as to say that incentives don't work. And those are fairly well targeted benefits. Other interesting behavioural scientists have also looked at the effect of lotteries on encouraging vaccination, which is particularly if you design a lottery in such a way that you might end up being a winner, but knowing that you missed out through failing to vaccinate yourself. Those can also be quite powerful incentives to encourage people to take up a behaviour when they're what you might call on the margin.
Looking at this Uber and Deliveroo discount, I was a bit peeved that I've actually already had my first jab or got my second jab already booked in. Maybe I should have just delayed because my compliance is not really being rewarded.
There is always the risk that people game the system a little bit, or that people might actually hold off on vaccination waiting for a higher offer, rather like those people who refuse to sell their house to a developer on the grounds that if they're the last person resisting, they'll get the best price. I mean, I would argue that to some degree, it's fair to say of younger people that the impetus to be vaccinated if you're 25 is not the same impetus if you're 55. Because the likelihood of fatality is minimal from COVID. And so it's a more pro-social act becoming vaccinated if you're young, whereas if you're older, you could argue, well, to some degree, it's a selfish act. And therefore, the engagement of some sort of additional incentive or encouragement for young people. Of course, it won't work on complete anti-vaxxers. It only works at the margins. But then if you think about it, epidemiology kind of works at the margins. In other words, you don't need absolutely everybody to be vaccinated in order for this thing to be killed. You just need a sufficiently high proportion of people to effectively bring the R rate below 1. And so it is important to say that, if you can do something via persuasion, my favourite methods of approaching a problem are, first of all, try persuading people. Then if that fails, try bribing people. And only if that fails should you ever consider compulsion. Now, the strange thing about government is it's dominated by lawyers who occasionally take advice from economists. And government tends to approach things from legislation first, inducement or financial incentive second, and persuasion third. Now, whatever the relative merits of those three interventions, and as a kind of temperamental libertarian, I always favour persuasion wherever possible. I don't think it's difficult to make the case that government often approaches those things in the wrong order.
What do you think persuasion looks like in this context when it comes to COVID? I saw a German advert last year, for example, asking young people to stay at home during lockdown and comparing their efforts to their grandparents' efforts in Second World War, and giving them sort of heroism to the thing.
I thought that was a brilliant thing, which, without mentioning the Second World War explicitly, okay. What it effectively said is, in the past, and I have made that, funnily enough, I made that argument in a similar way beforehand. I said, Americans are going completely bananas about wearing masks. But I would argue that compared to being forced to fight in the Tet Offensive, okay, or go into the jungle being shot at by the Viet Cong, I would argue that wearing a mask down the high street of Moline is a relatively small inconvenience to have to endure. And the Germans took this same framing and did it rather brilliantly, which more or less said it had an elderly person effectively in the future talking about their service. And it was contrasting implicitly the difference between being forced to fight the Ivans on the Eastern Front and merely staying at home ordering pizzas and watching Netflix. And it was incredibly funny and charming, and I think it was all the more persuasive because it was humorous. I think one of the things that the Germans managed to do, which interestingly maybe the British didn't, was partly to use a little bit of humour. Now we know, historically, humour is a magical means, just as music is, in a sense, for generating an emotional state without some of the negatives that arise if you try and use the sheer brute force of reason. And you can make points humorously, which are then accepted, which would be rejected if you tried to make them in deadly seriousness. And so I thought the Germans deserve a significant commendation for how they handled it. And it seemed to have worked. I think it is important to remember that many things, and I'd include that things like adoption of electric cars, okay? We don't need everybody to adopt electric cars. Forcing people or bribing people to adopt electric cars unfairly punishes a lot of people who, by dint of their circumstances, can't or won't adopt them. So persuasion should always be the first mode of intervention, simply because it harvests the low-hanging fruit. And sometimes the low-hanging fruit is all you need. I've argued for ages as just an environmental policy. Look, if you encourage people to put their tumble dryers and washing machines on later at night, okay, that will actually reduce carbon emissions, simply because the UK is kind of nuclear powered or powered heavily by renewables at 10 o'clock in the evening in a way that it isn't at 5 o'clock. Now, if you try and make that compulsory or you use the price mechanism, what happens to people who work the night shift? They can't do it. You don't want them leaving their house with a tumble dryer on. What happens to people who live in a flat and their washing machine is immediately above their neighbour's bedroom, which means it's going to hit the spin cycle at 1 o'clock in the morning? Those people can't do it. Now, the great thing with persuasion is if you've got a good reason, you can advance that reason and you're now immune or freed from the obligation. The second you start using economic incentives or legal directives, that nuance gets completely lost. And you try and design legislation for everybody, which in some cases ends up working for nobody.
And we've only really seen that persuasion. You've had people like Gareth Southgate making a short video asking young people to get vaccinated, but I've not really heard anything else really in that persuasion side. On the other hand, we have heard about vaccine passports coming in for nightclubs under the thought that under 30s go to nightclubs and this is what's going to get them to get jabbed. What do you make of that? We had Sir Mark Walport, who is Patrick Vallence's predecessor in the chief scientific advisor role on Spectator TV recently, and he was calling that a nudge. I mean, it feels more like a shove.
Yes, the vaccine passport, of course, it's ambiguous in a way, in that, I mean, the way I describe myself is a default libertarian. I don't accept the idea that there aren't coordination problems. I don't accept the idea that there isn't a need for central. And I don't object. To put it very simply, I don't object to people painting lines in the car park. Okay, there are certain. If you're an extreme libertarian, you'd say it's interfering with my right to park at the diagonal. I don't object to that kind of thing. Painting white lines on the road is a nudge, if you like, okay? And, even Deirdre McCloskey, who's more libertarian, I think, than I am, argues that there's a large informational role that government can play, which needn't involve any kind of compulsion at all. Now, where does the issuing of a passport, where it's up to the private sector to determine whether they require that passport or not, where does that sit? Now, to me personally, and I admit this is very, very subjective, to me that's relatively uncontroversial if the passport is being policed by private entities who simply say, sorry, it's our restaurant. If you're not prepared to do this, you can't come in. When it becomes employers, for example, or academic institutions, no vax, no lecture, that gets a bit more contentious. Because you can argue, well, you don't necessarily have free choice there. You can't suddenly switch university according to their vaccine policy. And so it's complicated. I generally regard the imposition of vaccine rules by private institutions as, broadly speaking, acceptable. It gets more contentious, if you like, when it starts to be imposed in areas where I would argue that mask wearing, I don't really understand the massive dissent over masks, because to me, there are plenty of inconvenient things like wearing underpants that I do. Really, not necessarily for my own self-interest, but simply to avoid alarming other people. And I would place mask wearing in the field of courtesy, which is even if you don't believe in them. And I think they do work, by the way. I think at some level they undoubtedly work. But even if you don't believe in them, some people do, and it's deeply, discourteous to elderly people who may be alarmed by someone wandering around the shops without a mask. I think it's simply an act of courtesy to other people. Mm. And, it also sits within, I think, the reasonable realm of the precautionary principle. This might work, and generally the cost-benefit thing looks fairly high. When you're demanding people are vaccinated who are young, for example, and there are side effects to the vaccine among the young. They're not particularly unpleasant for the most part, but they're not negligible. I'm getting a bit more uncomfortable there, and I might also raise the question, well, what if, to be honest, it isn't necessary to hit 100%?
And Rory, just on that vaccine passport point, some people have been saying that because it's coming in September, not immediately, that actually all of it is just a ploy for people to get vaccinated, and come September, these passports may not even come into place. But what I wonder about that is that isn't it quite a hit on the government's credibility to do that kind of U-turn, to kind of dangle this kind of threat over young people and then rescind it as if they never wanted to do it in the first place? I mean, that credibility hit, surely in the minds of people, is actually not insignificant.
Well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Which is, how should we react to legislation which really exists for its signalling value rather than as an actual restraint on behaviour? So it acts as an accelerant, it encourages people to act fast. It's equivalent to only 4 seats left at this price, which is, you might as well do it now because you'll have to do it ultimately. Now, as you might expect, working in the advertising industry and with a strong interest in kind of behavioural science, legislation actually quite a lot of legislation in a way works that way. I mean, we don't impose speed limits rigorously, okay? We very rarely fine people for going 73 miles an hour. And so legislation which exists in potential but isn't necessarily enforced can have a value, because it essentially, it might accelerate a behaviour. It might make corporate decision making easier, because you can say this is going to be a legal requirement in 5 years' time, so we might as well start acting now. All our competitors will be doing this. So in solving coordination problems, laws which act to send a message rather than to actually necessarily be enforced, I would argue, are actually, from a libertarian point of view, fairly desirable in a funny kind of way, because they solve the coordination problem without necessarily limiting liberty. And so the way I always phrase it is, I'm not a pure libertarian, but I'm glad such people exist, because I think that mentality plays an essential component part in looking at decision making over how government intervenes with the populace. I'm not massively sympathetic towards anti-maskers, because it seems to be a very, very small price to pay, and it seems to be a slightly deranged fear. Anti-vaxxers, I would seek, if possible, because, there are potential arguments against universal vaccination. And anti-vaxxers in that case, I would seek to find an accommodation with them.
Rory Sutherland, thanks for joining Spectator TV.